In our study of the synthesis of yoga, in the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence, we are now in the last paragraph of the chapter. And here, Sri Aurobindo describes the highest worlds beyond the mind. You will recall the context of this chapter where he discusses the various relations between Purusha and Prakriti, consciousness and force of consciousness, soul and nature, and the various kinds of relations that these two can have, or that the soul can have with its nature, create the experience of a world, of all the worlds, and which generally we describe as the planes of consciousness being the primary gradations of these worlds. In these relationships between soul and nature, Sri Aurobindo had pointed out that the soul can also set up a relationship in which it feels itself as if hidden or lost in its own creative play of energy, of force. And at that point, we will say consciousness seems to be hidden and a product of nature. Or the soul can set up a relationship in which soul is fully revealed and nature and the play of its forces is a direct play of the will of the soul. And that would be the highest station of full expression of the soul. Right at the beginning of the chapter, he had described how if the soul chooses to hide itself, it is only so that it may reveal itself eventually. And the whole game of this play of relationships is for the increasing emergence of the being, consciousness, and delight. And if these are involved, then the goal is their evolution. If these are veiled, then the goal is their self revelation. And this was right at the beginning of the chapter. And it's important to remind ourselves of this in this last paragraph, where we will come to that idea once again. In between, he described how the relationships create the physical plane and the character of the physical plane, the vital plane, the mental plane, and the relationship between these planes, how the physical is a special expression of the vital a special expression of the mental, and by correspondence, the mental is a special formulation of the still higher spiritual ranges. He also described the complex connections between these planes and even the action of forces descending from the higher to the lower and rising from the lower to the higher. Conscious beings of the higher acting upon the lower, and the possibility of human beings setting up conscious relations with these higher beings in their higher planes. And all this we find to be so not only in the relation from the physical to the vital, but from the vital to the mental, from the mental to the spiritual. And so, in this last paragraph, he explains how this higher range above mind, these higher worlds are therefore supramental. They belong to the principle of supermind, the free spiritual or divine intelligence or gnosis, and to the triple principle of Satchidananda. From them, the lower worlds derive by a sort of fall of the Purusha into certain specific or narrow conditions of the play of the soul with its nature. And so the big picture is that all through, across all these planes, is the play of the soul and nature, consciousness and power of consciousness. And they are merely different ways, different relationships of the play. So these higher realms, he says, these also are divided from us by no unbridgeable gulf. There is a gulf, but it's not unbridgeable, meaning you can bridge it. But the bridge doesn't happen automatically. You have to make an effort. If you make the effort, you can bridge it. But there is a sense of a gulf. Just as in the animal consciousness, there is a gulf between the animal consciousness and the reasoning, rational mind. The animal has to, as if, struggle to rise to a rational thought, and it quickly lapses from the effort because it's not normal, it is not used to. The struggle is required to bridge the gap, and then it falls down from that gap. But it is these moments when the animal makes that effort that you can see in the animal something which is almost human, as if they are conscious. And in a few animals, you can see this gap is much thinner. When they look at you, you're conscious of an individualized being looking at you through those eyes. But otherwise, most animals, you look at them, they're playing, they're happy, but the individualized personality is not so formed. As you go down the rungs of evolution, the individualization becomes more and more flat. Now, all of this will be relevant to what we are going to discuss shortly. So, there is no unbridgeable gulf that divides, meaning we can bridge that, but there is something to be bridged. These worlds, they affect us through what are called the knowledge sheath and the bliss sheath, through the causal or spiritual body, and less directly through the mental body. You will recall in each of the earlier discussions, he had described how the mental world affects us not on the physical body, but through the mental body. The vital world affects through the vital body, and naturally, the spiritual worlds will affect us through the spiritual body. But what is the spiritual body made of? And the knowledge sheath and the bliss sheath. This we had briefly touched upon last time, but now we will dwell more into this, the full sense of this. Nor are their secret powers absent from the workings of the vital and material existence. So they may act more directly through the spiritual body, less directly through the mental body, and there is an influence. It's not absent. There is an influence which is also working through the vital and material existence, but we can barely recognize it. So our conscious spiritual being and our intuitive mind awaken in us as a result of the pressure of these highest worlds on the mental being in life and body. And this is where we had paused last time. The most important idea here is the emergence of the conscious spiritual being and the intuitive mind awakening is not the result of something happening in our effort, but by the pressure of those worlds. Because this implies that it will happen irrespective. We may believe all we want that mind is the highest, mind is the only consciousness, and there is nothing beyond. But the fact that there are these worlds and they act upon our mind is enough to ensure that eventually in the mind the higher faculties will awaken. And even if we deny it, it will happen. We will just call it a higher power of the mind or a higher functioning of the mind or psychic powers or supra rational, whatever name we may choose to give. But it will happen because they exist there and they are exercising a pressure constantly. But when we become conscious and we begin to make a link from below upward, we participate in that action and we form the link. The descending force pressure from above joins with our ascending aspiration and effort. And the link consciously made, the whole thing can become extremely rapid. Because now, instead of having an indirect pressure that we are always pretending as if it doesn't exist, or even that we refuse, we open ourselves. And the action of that higher power, because it is free, it is liberated, the action of that is immediate. Or because it is utterly conscious of our limitations, its action is only as much as we are able to contain in our current evolution, but still immediate. And so, by a repeated series of influxes from above, our consciousness is prepared, opened up, and even lifted up. So, these two things he says, conscious spiritual being and intuitive mind awakening, is because of that pressure, but our participation can make all the difference. This being said, the next sentence now he says, how far can this whole thing go? But this causal body is, as we say, little developed in the majority of men, and to live in it or to ascend to the supramental planes is the most difficult thing of all for the human being. And there's a parenthetical statement within, but to ascend to the supramental planes as distinguished from corresponding subplanes in the mental being, or still more to dwell consciously upon them, is the most difficult thing of all for the human being. So here comes a very important idea. There is an ascent that will take place, and in that ascent, that last stage, entering fully into the supramental, is difficult, or living in it is difficult. But there's something which is easier, and that is living in their corresponding subplane in the mind. And you will recall this goes back to a couple of chapters before, when he was describing the problem of the difficulties of the mental being when it ascends to the higher ranges. The problem was, he says, that the mental consciousness is unable to enter into those domains precisely because they are supramental. Just as the physical body is unable to experience the mental plane, it can try as it might to seize. It cannot. It is too crude, too gross. The mental too fine compared to the physical. And the same happens from the mind to the spiritual. It is unable to seize that which is infinite and indivisible, where mind needs pieces to be able to catch a tiny part. And that is not peace. It cannot be cut into piece. So, what happens when mind arises? It goes into a kind of a whiteout. It becomes numbed. It feels as if becoming blank and is unable to register fully. Or it makes the transition, lives in that, and from there, when you return, you've as if lost the memory. So, going back to the text, which was there maybe 3 or 4 chapters before, he says, the transformation is possible because, although the divine planes are above the mental consciousness, and to enter actually into them, we have ordinarily to lose the mental in samadhi. Yet there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper, although modified by the conditions dominant here of mentality. All that belongs to the experience of the divine plane can there be seized. That is, in these higher ranges of the mental. Can there be seized, but in the mental way and in a mental form. To these planes of divine mentality, it is possible for the developed human being to arise in the waking state. Or it is possible for him to derive from them a stream of influences and experiences which shall eventually open to them and transform into their nature his whole waking existence. So, this is the whole rationale of the transformation. And now he is relinking to that idea in this part of the chapter, that there are subplanes in the mental being corresponding to those highest ranges, where the principle of that highest truth is represented but in a slightly reduced, mentalized form. And so we can enter those parts, those planes. But to go beyond them into the spiritual proper, the supramental proper, involves a kind of a loss, or it's very difficult to stay. So he says it can be done in the trance of samadhi, but otherwise only by a new evolution of the capacities of the individual Purusha, of which few are even willing to conceive. You could enter those states. But the act of entering into them, your physical body and all the lower corresponding parts of your being will go into this kind of a silence or complete stillness, which we will call trance state. You will be immersed there, and when you come back and reactivate this lower part, that thing will recede. It seems as if to be two completely separated poises of consciousness, only because the Purusha has not developed within its current evolution the corresponding capacity of consciousness to experience that and live in it without losing this. Very similar to what might have happened in a first attempt to rise to the mental plane. But here, even more trenchant because the two are so separate, so different. And for the description of this separateness and difference, we will briefly read from another text of Sri Aurobindo, where he describes this in greater detail. This is from the Life Divine, where he says, the oldest Vedantic knowledge tells us of 5 degrees of our being: the material, the vital, the mental, the ideal, which is the supramental, the spiritual or beatific. And to each of these grades of our soul, there corresponds a grade of our substance, a sheath, as it was called in the ancient figurative language. A later psychology found that these 5 sheaths of our substance were the material of 3 bodies: gross physical, subtle, and causal. And in all of which the soul actually and simultaneously dwells. Although here and now we are superficially conscious only of the material vehicle. So here's a very interesting mapping. Remember, we have 7 planes, of which the 5 have corresponding in us sheaths or gradations of substance which have combined or joined to form our individual being. These gradations of substance broadly coalesce to form 3 bodies. The gross physical body is the combination of this physical sheath, annam, as well as the pranic sheath. Life force joining into matter makes the living body. Similarly, life force joining with the mental sheath makes for the living mental consciousness, mental body, subtle body. Above that, it is these two, the supramental and the word he has used here is spiritual or beatific. The ideal for supramental and the spiritual Anandamaya Kosha and Vijnanamaya Kosha sheaths combining to form the spiritual body. And this body, distinct from mental body, distinct from physical body. So we have 3 bodies. And the interesting point he makes is that we live in each of these simultaneously, and in which the soul actually and simultaneously dwells, although here and now we are superficially conscious only of the material vehicle. Where do we normally live in our awareness? The physical body, not sheath, but body. And of this, only the surface part. And how do we know that? Simply because recognize that within your physical body, there are so many operations currently going on of which you're entirely unconscious? Are you conscious of your digestion? Can you feel the blood flowing in your veins? Can you feel the electrical signals moving? You're unconscious of it all. What you have as an experience is only a very superficial, sensory, semi mental, emotional, physical experience. And that's why we are largely reactive on that surface part. From morning through evening, from the point we wake up to the point we sleep, we are reacting to our circumstances. Something happens, we respond. We rarely consciously choose an action which is utterly independent of our circumstances. Rarely do we find a circumstances come upon us provoking a reaction, but a part of us separates and say, no, I refuse this reaction. These moments where we are master and not reactive are so rare. And all of this is on the surface of the physical body. We are not even living the mental life. It's primarily the part of the mind that connects to the physical senses in which we live. And if we were able to live in the mental life proper, we would find we would be almost entirely free of the need of external entertainment, because in our mind we can create all that we want, experience all that we want, play with all the ideas, and the mental universe is bigger than the physical universe, more fascinating, and you're pretty much free to do what you like. But even more interesting and even greater is the spiritual consciousness, in which, as we begin to awaken and grow, we experience the reality. Where in mind and in the mental world, we experience a grade of reality. In the spiritual, you experience the reality of it all, including of the mind and of matter. And all is seen and experienced in a consciousness which is essentially infinite. And so the whole experience is of a different order altogether. But we don't dwell there. We dwell partly in the mind, mostly in the physical. But simultaneously, our soul is on all three levels. The problem, though, is this spiritual body is not sufficiently developed, not sufficiently organized, and therefore, even when we momentarily touch it, we do not have a complete experience of the spiritual world. Just as an animal can momentarily touch mental consciousness but cannot live in it, and therefore cannot have the kind of mental life that we have. Now he says, but it is possible to become conscious in our other bodies as well. And it is in fact the opening up of the veil between them, and consequently between our physical, psychical, and ideal personalities, which is the cause of those psychic and occult phenomena that are now beginning to be increasingly, though yet too little and too clumsily, examined, even while they are far too much exploited. And then he discusses how the whole old tradition in India, the old Hatha Yogin and Tantrics of India, had long ago reduced this matter of the higher human life and body to a science. He discusses the 6 centers through which these faculties can be accessed and so on. And the result of it giving mastery over life force, etc. And here comes the more important point. Behind all these terms of ancient psychophysical science lies the one great fact and law of our being, that whatever be its temporary poise of form, consciousness, power in this material evolution, there must be behind it, and there is a greater, a truer existence, of which this is only the external result and the physically sensible aspect. Our substance does not end with the physical body. That is only the earthly pedestal, the terrestrial base, the material starting point. As there are behind our waking mentality vaster ranges of consciousness, subconscient and superconscient to it, of which we become sometimes abnormally aware, so there are behind our gross physical being other and subtler grades of substance with a finer law and a greater power, which support the denser body, and into which and which can, by our entering into the range of consciousness belonging to them, be made to impose their law and power on our dense matter, and so on. So he's now describing this whole relationship between these bodies, but more on the lower range. And this was from the Life Divine, the chapter titled The Ascending Series of Substance. But we go to another text, which is in which he enters even more in detail, and especially on this aspect about corresponding subplanes. And this text is from Sri Aurobindo's writings on the Veda. It is something quite intricate, quite complex, and he goes into that level of intricacy and complexity because he is trying to explain the way the Veda approached this whole situation of our current evolution. So the Vedas saw not only that there are these three bodies, there are all these sheets, 5 sheets, but 7 planes, meaning 2 more sheets are waiting to emerge still undeveloped. But they saw in our current focus of evolution, where we are plugged in and conscious only of that narrow band, all these 7 are as if connecting, entering, and playing their role in a very complex operation. All these planes are operating now in a more complex and more rich but different relationship. So, if you can look at it this way as a picture first, in the beginning of evolution, all this full range of reality, the 7 streams of consciousness or principles, focus themselves on the action in matter to awaken from matter life. As the life organizes itself, all these 7 planes now focus on developing the possibilities of life force in matter. And then, as that is completed and mind begins to emerge, they shift their focus to the operation of emerging mind. And at each of these steps, all these planes create, by their corresponding powers, corresponding finer gradations or faculties or powers of consciousness. Where are we today in our evolution? What is this mind that we have? And that's what he describes here. And it's a little complex because there are a lot of Sanskrit terms used, but I will suggest to stay with it, and I will, as far as possible, replace the Sanskrit word by the English word so that you do not get confused with the terms. But when we complete this passage, you will understand the complexity of the play of what is happening now in the evolution. And with this, you will suddenly appreciate how profound the whole Vedic psychology and even their process of yoga is. So he describes first what we have just read, that there are so many gradations. So, man, according to Vedic psychology, consists of 7 principles in which the Atman cases itself. So the starting point is the divine consciousness. When it manifests through these 7 principles, well, it is as if the 7 principles are its layers of expression. Now you can see this at the level of the cosmos. It is equally true of the individual. When the Atman chooses to enter an individual experience in the cosmos, it again is cased in these 7 layers, 7 principles. So he lists them: Annam, gross matter; Prana, vital energy; Manas, intelligent mind; Vijnanam, ideal mind, which he also calls supramental; Ananda, pure or essential bliss; Chit, pure or essential awareness; Sat, pure or essential being. So you have Sat, Chit, Ananda, ideal mind, supramental, and then mind, vital, physical. This is how we have known it always. But they are each 7 principles. And so, as principles, they are operating everywhere. So, within any plane, all 7 principles are present, creating naturally by their sevenfold operation the appearance or the experience of 7 subplanes. And within each of those, of course, all 7 principles are operating because they're always together. They never separate. They're aspects of the self. So within each of those 7 subplanes, you have as if 7 functions or a sevenfold operation of consciousness. So this is just as a background to appreciate what follows next. In the present stage of our evolution, ordinary humanity has developed Annam, that is matter; Prana, life force, manas, mind, for habitual use. That's how we live, thinking animals. And well developed men are able to use with power the Vijnanam, ideal mind. But that's only in a few, not everyone. But even not in the true power. So, well developed men are able to use with power the Vijnanam acting not in its own habitation, nor in its own form, but in the mind and as reasoning faculty, buddhi. So here is an extraordinary insight. What we pride in ourselves as this power of the intellect, by which I can think, rationalize, organize my thoughts, deduce, induce, and create all kinds of possibilities, is nothing but the reflection in the domain of the mind of the power of Vijnana, of the supermind, acting not in its own world but in an inferior world as an inferior agent. Now, think about what the supermind does in the cosmic working. It organizes, places in perfect relation everything with everything. That's the role of the supermind. Across space, across time, across eternity, across infinity, all possibilities which are inherent in the divine are held in a simultaneous and perfect alignment with each other. It is that which makes this universe to be cosmos, ordered, structured, perfectly, each point in harmony with everything else. And that ordering power is what our mind recognizes and says, there is a law by which the universe works. There is a law that ensures this is like this and everything is in such and such relation. No, it's not law. It is the spontaneous, free, perfect arrangement in which the supermind knows and sees all its possibilities. That perfect order appears to us in mind because mind has to translate it in terms of what it knows. It reduces it to the idea of a law that makes everything happen. But to the supermind, it is the spontaneous deploying of all its powers in perfect harmony. So, that function is replicated at a very inferior and crude level in the mind in what we call intellect. But here, intellect doesn't know everything. It assembles pieces and then it starts arranging pieces to create an order. It is not spontaneous, it is not free, it is not complete, but it imitates that function in a much lesser and degraded manner. Now we recognize what it means for the higher principle to operate in a lower plane. Okay, we get a first glimpse of this. There's a similar operation in the vital nature also, where something of this organizing principle comes. And it may take other forms, less obviously seen, but it'll be a kind of a centering of the life force moving back and forth. Instead of being chaotic and spread out, it would hold the thread of all the life energies operating and hold them in some kind of order. That would be the principle operating in life energy, and similarly, even in matter. So, extraordinary men. So, well developed men are able to use with power the Vijnanam acting not in its own habitation nor in its own form, Rupa, Vijnanam, but in the mind and as reasoning faculty, Buddhi. Ordinary men are able to aid the action of Manas and Buddhi proper by the Vijnanam acting in the intelligent mind indeed, and so out of its proper sphere, but in its own form as ideal consciousness. The combination of Manasik and Vijnani action making what is called genius. So you see, the first imitative operation in the mind, a reflection of a very crude order, is this intellect. And yes, all of us have a little bit of it today, but we don't always use it. But the genius is one who links this intellect with something of that higher power now working in the lower plane, but in its own terms, not having lost its form. But the characteristic power of supermind operating in an inferior medium creates what, and in this combination creates this appearance of genius. What does the genius do? He looks at the same situation where the rest of us are struggling and says, this is it. How did you get it? I might take 2 hours to get, you got it in 2 seconds. Or he says, it's obvious. But he cannot explain how he did it. Because he himself is not conscious of where this knowledge comes from. So it is still an inferior working of that higher knowledge, but the knowledge is operating in this lower substance, and the ego seizes on its working and says, I have it, I know it. But actually it doesn't. It is the knowledge which fills it and awakens in it something. But this power of genius is this higher working in its form, but in lower substance. So remember earlier, intellect was inferior substance, inferior form. Genius is inferior substance, but in the original form of the true knowledge. And that's why this formation of the genius and the intuition is the link through which we rise into the supramental. He continues the text. Action making what is called genius, pratibhanam, the Sanskrit word he uses, which if you had to translate literally would represent something like representative illumination. Prati is like a representation, bhanam, the light, illumination, representative illumination, which he translates like this: a reflection or luminous response in the mind to higher ideation. So we can describe it like this: our mind working reflects or has a higher response because of that thing which is there, which we are not directly conscious. So it's as if you have a bowl of water. You are unable to see the sun. You can only look at the water. But the sunlight reflects in the water and strikes your eye, and you say, yes, there is the light. There is the light. I have the light. I'm holding the light in my hand. I've seized the sun. I own the sun. I possess it. But all you've possessed is a reflection. And even that reflection is sometimes too brilliant and can hurt your eyes. You've not really seen the sun, and certainly you do not live in its domain. And this is what we will call the intuitional working, the genius working. A luminous response in the mind or reflection to the higher ideation. The yogin goes beyond to the Vijnanam itself, to the supermind. Or, if he is one of the greatest rishis, like Yajnavalkya, to the Ananda. So some of the great yogis may ascend to the Vijnanam, but the greatest go beyond to the Ananda. But he doesn't speak of anything beyond that. Go beyond, none, like the Yajnavalkya to the Ananda. None in ordinary times go beyond the Ananda in the waking state. For the Chit and Sat are only attainable in Sushupti, that is Samadhi of trance state. In Sushupti, because only the first 5 sheaths or Panchakosha are yet sufficiently developed to be visible, except to the men of the Satya Yuga, and even by them the 2 others are not perfectly seen. So this, we pause to consider what that means. You see, in the evolution, our physical body is obviously formed and organized. It has an independent existence of its own. Even if the mind was knocked out, even if the vital body was knocked out, the physical body, with whatever vitality it has bound, can go on almost mechanically, which is what we see in quite a large number of biological phenomena. You can, for example, take out an organ from the body and the organ will continue to function on its own, except it can't sustain function because it does not have the supporting framework of the body. But the body itself as a whole can continue mechanically even after the soul leaves. So this is an organized body. A similar organization exists in the mental body. When we leave our physical body, we can live in the subtle body and in the mind body and move around, do things, operate as an individual person. The spiritual body is not so well organized. And so there, when we enter, already for most of us, we would be in a kind of a half trance state. But to go beyond that, Since the bodies are not developed, you cannot live in it or operate in it as an individual. So, what happens is, as you enter those domains, all of these parts shut down, they go into a trance state. Your consciousness is there, but not individualized, not organized. And so, you're unable to operate as an individual. And so, the five sheaths are not sufficiently developed to be visible. And beyond that, even the rest are invisible to, even except in the Satyuga. Even by them, the two others are not perfectly seen. So there's like a vague umbra, like a halo you can sense, yes, that's all, but it's not organized. What you will, implication is that as the evolution proceeds, these bodies are organized on these higher gradations of substance all the way to the highest. And that's when we have an individual who links from the most material to the highest Sachidananda in one being, as if a microcosmos, the whole cosmos represented in an individual, and each individual such like a pillar linking the highest to the lowest. It is in this context that I find the symbolism interesting in the Matri Mandir. You have in the main meditation chamber, the mother described these pillars rising and they fall short of the ceiling. Interesting. If you look at it in an evolutionary term, we have risen up to this point where we open to the spiritual, but there's still this organization to be completed in the individual form. But if you look at it that way, each individual would be almost like a pillar linking the lowest to the highest and then interacting with each other. And that would be the nature of the revealed play of the delight of the divine. But we continue with the text. He now describes, again, a little bit of vocabulary. Don't worry about it, stay with the idea. From the supermind to the physical is the aparardha or lower part of existence, where vidya is dominated by avidya. Vidya is consciousness of oneness, avidya is consciousness of multiplicity or division. So, from supermind to the physical plane is the lower half of the cosmos, where the oneness is dominated by the multiplicity. So, oneness is hidden, division is dominant. From the Ananda to the Sat is the Parardha or a higher half, in which avidya, multiplicity, is dominated by vidya, unity, oneness. And there is no ignorance, pain, or limitation. Why? Because everything lives in the oneness first and then plays with multiplicity from its freedom in oneness. So when you live in oneness, obviously, there is no ignorance because all is revealed, all is known. Ignorance is when some part is cut out and you don't know. Equally, there is no pain because all that you meet, even in the most intense impact, is yourself in oneness. And so there is never a pain of collision of two other. There is no otherness. And therefore, obviously, as a result, no limitation because all is in oneness and in infinity. Contrast this with the lower, where the division dominates, oneness is hidden. So I meet you, first I have fear. Who are you? Are you safe? Are you friend? Are you enemy? And yet I can see you because you're a part of the oneness. Otherwise, I would not be able to see you. Think about it. If two things had nothing in common, how would they know each other? There has to be something in common which allows a nature of contact by which you can say there is some other thing, isn't it? You can see because the common feature linking us is the reflection of the light and substantiality of light and the relationship with the light. So the light reflects between us, and you say, we are there, we can see. Similarly, if your hand reaches out, if this other thing did not have the same character and quality of materiality, your hand would pass right through as it passes right through radio waves. You do not see them, you do not feel them because you have nothing in common with radio waves, isn't it? And so, because there is an underlying oneness, the experience of otherness is possible. Think of it this way. And all experience of otherness conceals something which is oneness. If nothing else, at a very physical level, you say, another human being. Now I'm scared because it's another human being. If it was a rock or a plant, I wouldn't be scared. Because it is another human being, because we are so similar, I have fear of being lost or absorbed or destroyed. And so the oneness holding the two, if the difference is strong and does not remember the oneness, there is a collision of or fear, suffering, and so on. Always ignorance is the sense of separation. But if you awaken to the sense of oneness underlying, and the person takes off his mask and says, "Oh, it's you, you're my brother. Why did you put on a mask? You scared me for a moment." Now we hug each other. You see the difference? The separating element removed, you wake up and you recognize yourself as belonging to the same one family, one self, one divine. And as the masks are as if peeled off in the evolution, you begin to experience the whole universe more and more as yourself, your family, or the one divine appearing in so many ways and forms, concealed through so many masks. And so in the lower, you have all this experience of ignorance, pain, and limitation because of the sense of separation dominating. But without the underlying oneness, you could not have had all these experiences. And because everything is held by the oneness, the revelation of oneness is inevitable. And the play of balance between the oneness and multiplicity changing is what we may call the awakening of our consciousness, isn't it? As we evolve and grow in consciousness, the oneness begins to dominate, the difference begins to reduce. Until we make the transition to the upper half, where oneness dominates and separation, division is an appearance which you play with for the purpose of the play only. So, why is this important? He is describing this whole cosmos as one whole with an upper half and a lower half, and this play of oneness and multiplicity. But this is the scheme of the Veda, the upper and the lower then as if is a reflection of the upper. And so within the lower, all the faculties or powers of the upper are represented or as crudely reflected. So now we come to the important point of this reflection. In man, as he is at present developed, the intelligent mind is the most important psychological faculty. And it is with a view to the development of the intelligent mind to its highest purity and capacity that the hymns of the Veda are written. Now think of the context here. In our current evolution, where we are at, the Vedic hymns are trying to capture this play of the whole universe focused on this grade of consciousness and assist this next step. Now he describes what is happening here in this intelligent mind. In this mind, there are successively the following principles. Now he's going to list them, and you will see how all these 7 planes and some of the subplanes are as if reflected in this. In fact, what you will see is 9 principles and then the self using them. And the 9 principles you'll find broadly you can make groups of 3 into 3. So I'm giving this as a reference. As we describe, you can organize them in your mind. In this mind, there are successively the following principles. Remember, it's mind, it's not body. He's talking of your mind, your consciousness that says, I'm conscious. Okay. So first, Sukshma Annam, the refinement of the gross matter out of which the physical part of the mental sheath or subtle body is made. Now, he's used many Sanskrit words, I just translated them. The mental sheath has a physical part, just as the physical sheath has a vital part or a mental part leaning towards those. So the densest part of the mental sheath or the subtle body, as the subtle body plugs into the physical, there has to be something corresponding, something common between the two, resonating between them, which could allow for the link to happen. Otherwise, they could never meet. So the densest part of the subtle body, which is almost material in character, that's what Sri Aurobindo calls the subtle physical. So this is the first gradation. In your mind, in the thinking part of the mind, this is part of your awareness. Second principle, subtle prana, the vital energy in the mind which acts in the nadis or nervous system of the subtle body and which is the agent of desire. Very interesting. In a physical body, you have, of course, physical nervous system. In that physical nervous system, there is life force which flows. But in the mental body, there is also a nervous system in which a finer grade of life energy flows, and it has its own complex flows. And then the subtle body joining with the physical body imprints those flows upon the physical body's energy flows, which makes for the experience of what we are. And it is this joining of the two and the map of the energy flows which is the basis for acupuncture. So if you see the acupuncture charts, you will see lines of energy flow, and sometimes something which is at the head is actually connecting to the liver and going all around this way and that way, and another flows in a particular way. And there's a difference between the left side and the right side. And none of this would make sense if it was purely physical biology. It makes enormous sense when you look at the subtle body and its character and the flow of consciousness and energy of consciousness. But this gradation of life force in the subtle body is the agent of desire. Now, this is one of the very important questions which always puzzled me. Why is it that when you remember something, okay, you have a thought, but it provokes a physical reaction in your body or a strong emotional character which is almost physical? Anger, hatred, love, excitement, whatever form it takes, can have a physical character just by the mere thought of it. A word spoken, and suddenly there's a trigger on the biology. Or the other question is corresponding. Why is it that if you're injected with certain hormones, it triggers certain patterns of emotion and thought? What's the link point between what is purely biological and what is purely psychological? There has to be something linking the two. And here he gives you that answer, that it is the vital energy in the mind, the subtle vitality, which is the agent of desire. And it's interesting to see how nature has programmed on that level. Just as she has programmed in the biology, she has programmed in the mental body also certain tendencies. You will see at certain ages, certain patterns of behavior kick in. Just as in the biology, at certain ages, the genes suddenly trigger as if there's a genetic clock that says, okay, now we have to grow, now you have to stop growing, now you have to change, now you have to regenerate this or create that, now you have to shrink some other part whose function is over. There's a clock tracking it. A similar process actually takes place. All this is controlled by the life force. Gross life force in the gross body, subtle life energy in the subtle body. It's fascinating to recognize, and if you can experience the distinction within you of these two, then you can even begin to as if seize it and shape it and change it eventually. But to recognize the mechanism, so we've only touched two of the things so far, two principles. The third is chitta, or receptive consciousness, which receives all impressions from without and within by tamasic reaction. But being tamasic does not make them evident to the sattvic consciousness or intelligent awareness, which we call knowledge. So that we remember with the chitta everything noticed or unnoticed, but that knowledge is useless for our life owing to its lying enveloped in tamas. Okay, it's quite a detailed thing, but the basic idea is this, that there is this gradation which is the receptive consciousness, substance of mind is how Sri Aurobindo translates chitta elsewhere, in which automatically everything is registered. So if you look at the biology, we're talking of the mind. So in the mind, this gradation, which is almost like an underlying substance. It has almost a materiality to it, but it's passive. Everything that comes into it, it registers from outside and from inside. So let's say you're sleeping, and there's a cricket which goes crick, crick, crick. It registers. Somebody walks by talking. Every little detail of the conversation is registered. Do you remember it? No. When you're paying attention and trying to remember, you miss more than half of what's actually happening. And if you're listening to one person and you're engrossed in conversation, someone comes eventually and say, I rang the bell 10 times, you didn't hear. No, I'm sorry, I didn't hear, I was engrossed here. But that's your surface conscious intelligence. This chitta registered everything. And as a dramatic demonstration of its capacity, we could ask you, since you woke up this morning, how many steps did you actually take? You don't remember, you're not even conscious. That's your normal intelligence, which is a little piece. The chitta retains every little detail. And as you got out of bed, that little insect which was crawling on the floor that you didn't notice, and an ant which was nearby that you didn't notice, and the cobweb and a little spider which was moving which you didn't notice are all registered in the chitta. What an extraordinary store of content, of memory, but entirely passive, and because so passive, inaccessible to your intelligence. Does not make evident to the sattvic consciousness or intelligent awareness, which we call knowledge. So that we remember with the chitta everything, noticed or unnoticed. But that knowledge is useless for our life, owing to its lying enveloped in tamas, inertia. But under hypnosis, you could be asked, how many steps did you take? And under hypnosis, you're actually accessing a deeper power faculty that taps into this chitta and pulls out an exact number, which today your little watch may tell you 1,857. You have these little watches, digital things which track the movement of your arms and figure out how many steps you take. But this is still external knowledge. That would be an exact internal awareness. You will remember in detail, and the little spider and the ant and everything else that you had not noticed. Through all senses. Anything registered impacting the chitta by whatever means. And he says both externally and internally. And that means all the thoughts that you had since you woke up this morning, all the dreams you had at night, which you have entirely forgotten, everything is registered there. And then there are other things you sense. You see, your five senses are still very crude. You have beyond them subtler senses, which include a subtle sense when somebody is walking by behind you. You may not sense with your five senses, but on a subtle level, you can feel the energies, connections. We have sensitivities to so many other things, qualities of vibration, and even on a physical level, the alignment of the magnetic field, and all these things would be registered. Nothing is lost. Okay, so this is now three gradations or three principles which are working in our current organization of the mind. And we're going to go through the next three, and you'll see they're of a slightly higher character. So the next after this is Hrit. Hrit is Hrid, we could say heart or emotion. Hrit, or the tamas or the rajasic reaction to impressions, which we call feeling or emotion. Or when it is habitual, character. So that's the fourth principle. And you see, unlike the previous one, which was largely tamasic in inertia, this one is reactive. Something comes and there's a feeling, there's an emotional response. But it is not the formal free play of emotions, just a response. And character is that mechanical response which has become habitual. Next, manas, or active, definite, sensational consciousness, rendering impressions of all kinds into percept or concept by a sattvic reaction called intelligence or thought. which men share with the animals. So this is common among animals equally. So any sensational impact that comes is turned into a perception. This is warm, this is cool, this is nice, this is not nice, this is pleasant, unpleasant. Or concept. The person who gives me food is good. The person who takes away my food is bad. And there are good people and there are bad people. Once the concept forms, when a new person comes, is this person good or bad? Now, all this operation, which actually is a large part of our human mental consciousness, which we call intelligence, is shared with animals. Or rational, imaginative, and intellectually mnemonic faculty. So you rationalize, you imagine, or you reduce or represent by symbols. Observing, retaining, comparing, reasoning, comprehending, combining, and creating. All these are faculties of buddhi. The amalgam of which functions we call intellect. So here is a new faculty that's coming in, I think the seventh, where you have the power to organize. And this, remember, was the supramental principle represented in an inferior working and in an inferior form. Then, above that, three, which as if turn to the spiritual subplanes of our mind. That's where it connects to the text we're reading. But now you understand the full spectrum of these gradations. So, next principle, Manasa Ananda, or the mind's or mental quality of Ananda, or the pure bliss of existence manifesting through the impure mind, body, and prana impurely. That principle of Ananda, of Satchidananda, represented in the domain of mind and operating for mind, life, body, but impurely, that is, mixed with pain of various kinds, but in itself pure because disinterested. Ahaituka. Now, this is very interesting, deep recognition that the principle of Ananda, which is properly in its own domain, in its own form, in the supermind, is actually filling the whole universe. The play and expression of that delight is the whole purpose of this whole universe. But when it enters this lower gradation of consciousness, it is operating in inferior material, but also by an inferior operation. So, manifested through impure body, but in itself pure. If the Ananda itself had been lost in its purity, then we would not know the delight of existence. And Sri Aurobindo points to this as something as if an underlying atmosphere or consciousness or principle which fills everything. For everything that exists, as if at the backdrop there is this delight of existence. The flower exists because there is a delight to be. And in the human being, it takes on a more mentalized form. So in the mind, we will say, it's so wonderful to be alive. In the vital, it will take a slightly different vitalistic character, which will say, I feel so excited, enjoying to be alive. The mind stands back in a more calm and sattvic manner says, oh, what an extraordinary experience. It is so wonderful to be alive. The body may have its own equivalent, of which we are not mostly conscious. But the idea is behind that underlying. If the Ananda was not in itself supporting in purity, it would not be this delight. But the moment it supports, or the moment it enters from support, it is mixed in something which is impure. And so, manifesting through the impure mind, body, and prana impurely. So it manifests in an impure mind, but the manner of manifestation is also impure. Manifests is impure vital and body, and the form of manifestation is impure. The result is you don't recognize Ananda. And so you say, you're attracted to one aspect of it and or repelled from another aspect of it, Or you say, whenever I feel this excitement and enthusiasm, I feel alive. But it is the excitement and enthusiasm in which the Ananda has been warped. But it is not the true Ananda. And so we cannot recognize. When he says, he explains what is this mixture or manner of impurity of expression mixed with pain of various kinds, but in itself pure because disinterested. Ahaituka. This because disinterested goes to a very deep yogic principle. If it was interested, it couldn't remain pure. Because it is disinterested, it has no personal interest. It is simply there because that's how it is. It can stay what it is. The moment it takes an interest, it takes a bias, it takes an aspect which is limited or twists or distorts its underlying wholeness, it ceases to become pure. You can catch that idea. So the liberated consciousness is disinterested and is liberated because disinterested. At the same time, from its poise of freedom, it can engage with everything uniquely, with full attention, but without biasing itself or limiting itself or distorting itself. So, this was the first of the upper three, that is the eighth, the seventh. And then next, Manasa tapas, this is the aspect of consciousness, gathered, intensified. Manasa tapas, or the pure willpower acting towards knowledge, feeling, and deed, impurely through the impure mind, body, and prana, mixed with weakness, dull inertia, and ignorance or error, but in itself pure because ahaituka, disinterested, without any ulterior purpose or preference that can interfere with truth of thought, act, and emotion. So here he has elaborated on that idea. The chit aspect, which is consciousness and power of consciousness. And so tapas will, when it operates in the mental grade, it becomes pure will acting towards knowledge, feeling, and action. But in material, which is impure mind, life, matter. And it is disinterested because it is without ulterior purpose or preference that can interfere with truth of thought, act, and emotion. You can dwell on what that means. The moment you have a personal interest, the truth can never act. It gets warped by your personal interest. So, this is now the eighth principle. And ninth, above this, ahaituka sat, or pure realization of existence operating through the impure organs as ahankara and bheda, egoism and limitation. Very interesting idea here. Where does our sense of ego come? How do I know I exist as separate from others? Because there is this principle of sat, itself disinterested. But when it operates within this band of your mental intelligence, it awakens in the mind, I exist, I am. And that great declaration, I think, therefore I am. But truly it is, I am, therefore I can think, therefore I am aware. So that sense of I am as an independent center comes from that principle operating within the mind. And it creates or it acts through the impure organs of egoism, which says, so ego is different from egoism. Ego is the sense of I, and the egoism is now a reference to myself as center of the universe. And limitation, bheda. The moment I am, the other is not I. And I cut myself off in sense of separation, which limits everything, mind, vital, physical, and my reality. But in itself pure and aware of unity in difference. So that consciousness or that principle operating behind the mind knows that this is the unity. There is a difference of appearance, but it holds the unity. That's why in this operation through the distorted egoism, I am spontaneously attracted to the other. The very thing which refuses to accept my egoism, I say, but Why don't you recognize my egoism? You will see it takes a very complex form in social relationships. When you feel you're the center of the universe, as long as people come and bow down and say, "Oh, you are the great film actor that we saw in so many movies," the film actor looks at them, yes, yes, he takes in the adulation. But when someone says, "Who are you?" the fellow is surprised. "You don't know me?" And then he's interested. He needs to engage with that which does not recognize his center. And often that's where they form very interesting relationships. That sense of someone who can walk away, "But how are you not recognizing me?" And he's attracted to that. Why? Because the underlying sense of oneness is, "But I must include this in my oneness." And something which is missing has to be as if drawn in. The moment it is drawn in, it loses interest. The nature of desire, it wants, and whatever it gets is now no more interesting. It needs to reach out to the other, which is not yet in. So the sense of an underlying unity is there, but the difference tends to predominate in the organ of action, and so the distortion happens. But in itself, pure and aware of unity in difference, because disinterested, not attached to any particular form or name in manifestation. So that principle operating through the mind says that everything is the same one divine in different appearances. Once it filters through the distortion of the egoism and division, it says this is more important, that is less important. And finally, remember, these are 9 principles. The 10th principle, operating in your mind as it is organized. And finally, Atman, or self, seated in mind. And this is the poise of the self that actually stands within the mind or behind the mind, supporting all its operations. Because it is there, all these are as if faculties or powers of its working in the mind. The total making for 10. It's very interesting in Sri Aurobindo's description when he organizes it like this. He explains in another writing that always in the evolution has to go through these 10 steps. In each step, it has to develop these faculties or their corresponding faculties at every level. Each one developed, the next one developed, reaches down and lifts all the others into itself. The next develops, reaches down all the others into itself. And so on, making for a very rich, intricate integration of all their working. If you had to take an analogy and recognize the point, it's an analogy. There is only one self. And as a symbol for our analogy, we will place it in the form of a spider, which is putting out a thread, a web, which is made of itself, its own stream of consciousness drawn out. And then it draws out, let's say, 7 principal streams, or let's say 7 colors of the rainbow. And then it takes those 7 colors or streams and then begins to dwell on each, and around it weave the other 6. And having woven this, it's one step of evolution. It takes the next thread and takes that as the principle and weaves all the other 6 around it. And then takes the next and weaves, and so builds as if a tapestry of reality and the unfolding and evolution of what it is. And always what is revealed is itself in increasing degrees of complexity and integration. Until eventually you have this extraordinary weaving which is dynamic. It's always moving. It's not a fixed image, it's a changing image, always introducing a new principle and a new color, a new range of possibilities. And once that is fully developed and integrated, another thrown in, another built up, layer by layer, step by step, introducing new principles. And each time that a new principle is introduced, it is at a lesser gradation of current development. So the same principle introduced later on will build on something already much richer, and so can bring out something more. So all 7 principles appear not once, but many times, but each time on a new level. And so 7 within 7, and within those again 7. And that makes for the full spectrum of the rich tapestry and always dynamic and playing out possibilities. But always it is the same one from whom it all pours out. We get a sense of this. And here we are in the current frame of our evolution, in this intelligent mind, these 10 principles and the self, which is, of course, supporting the whole thing, seated in mind. This Atman is positive and negative. And he uses other terminologies, both personal and impersonal. I skip that. And of all these, which is your station that you will call most yourself in the current evolution is your intellect, the buddhi, the part that says, I can think, I can organize my thoughts. So now he picks this point and goes deeper into it. He says, the buddhi again is divided into understanding, medha, which merely uses the knowledge given by the sensations and the like, manas, chitta, rit, prana, is subject, adhina, not Lord, Anisha, subject to sensation, reason, or buddhi proper, and a separate operation of the intellect of buddhi, which is superior to sensation and contradicts it in the derived light of a higher knowledge. You see the finer distinctions he brings. Now, why is all this important? This is what we are today. And if the yoga is to begin from where we are, recognizing all these powers and faculties within us and turning each one of them towards the divine, developing fully, enriching each of these faculties is part of the fullness of our divinization and transformation. All these faculties. Okay, and then there is one more, and direct jnanam. This is the higher faculty of buddhi. Direct jnanam or sattvam, which is itself that light or higher knowledge. We all have that, something of that higher light in our intelligence. And then there is the lower light or the lower intelligence working through the senses or standing back from the senses and contradicting. That we have a part in our intelligence which is open to that higher light makes possible for us, therefore, to consciously rise and allow it to act in us. Now, having presented this big picture, he puts it in the context of the Veda. All these faculties have their own devatas, conscious beings, one or many, each with his ganas or subordinate ministers. The jiva or spirit using these faculties is called the hansa, the swan, he who flies or evolves upward. And this is again a Vedic image. Our soul is the swan rising, using these faculties. When he leaves the lower and rises to the Satchidananda in the mind, using Sat, Chit and Ananda only, and reposing in the higher aspect of Atman or Vasudeva, then he is called Paramahansa, one who has gone or evolved to the highest in that stage of evolution, meaning there are high gradations to come. This is the fundamental knowledge underlying the Veda, the loss of which, aided by the corruption of the etymology, has led to the present confusion and degradation of its meaning. Then he lists all the deities of the Veda and how they correspond to each of these faculties. And then the whole logic of the Vedic yajna and the mechanism of the yoga becomes obvious. You invoke that deity, that power, activate that faculty, harmonize it with others, put them in relation to the self, and so on. The whole yoga is can be described almost like a process, a procedure, an algorithm of a kind, you can say. But it is done by consciously relating to these higher cosmic powers and functions, of which this functioning within your mind is an operation. So if, let's say, it is the power of your intellect that you wish to amplify, you recognize that your intellect is a tiny operation of the cosmic intellect. If it is the Indra, which is that, then we will invoke Indra. Fill me with your light. Amplify the power of my intellect. So he says Chandra is the Devata of the Prajna, Surya of the Satyam, Indra of the understanding and Manas, Vayu of the subtle Prana, Mitra, Varuna, Aryama, and Bhaga are the four masters of the emotional mind or character. Brihaspati of the pure chit and tapas of knowledge. Now, the moment you are conscious that these are conscious beings, you can build a relationship with them, invoke them, and develop and deepen the bond, and they work in you for the transformation. That's the nature of the Vedic yoga. In the integral yoga, the method is much simpler. We recognize all these as aspects and powers of the one divine and his energy, the divine mother, conscious divine energy. And we take each of these things and put them directly in relation to her. And the more they are able to turn to her and open and give themselves to her, the more she is able to pour her light and her force into each of these functions, develop them, amplify them, and harmonize them, because from a single action, from a single source, she lifts all this working and divinizes and transforms. And therefore, we may be conscious of these faculties without needing to know their names or terms. But to the extent that we are conscious, we are able to put that working in relation to her. To the extent that we are not conscious, we start with the part where we are conscious, and as she fills, she makes conscious the parts which currently are not conscious. And so the process is much simpler, but not in contradiction. It is complete in harmony with the Vedic movement, but takes it to a much more direct, much more complete way. So he explains how the gods are not merely symbols, they are actually powers. And how the divine is the Lord Isha, master of the Adhara, or the sevenfold medium of manifestation. And even the so called Daityas, Titans, they are equally divine, but their job is to disturb the functioning and to push you to rise by the rapid way, or they push you down to go through the slow way of nature. But their job is to ensure that you do not stay static. They're always pushing. So this we leave this aside now. He goes much deeper, describing the operations of Agni, links the physical science, psychological science, and spiritual science, shows how things operate across these different domains. But we leave all this aside, coming back to the important idea. Here, simply, the term used, corresponding subplanes in the mental being. Sorry? This is from the Hymns to the Mystic Fire, and there it is in his commentary on the Rig Veda text 1:1:1 to 3. And he takes those three verses and elaborates in this way, describing the whole psychology of the Veda. Maybe I can just tell you the page number in the new edition. It is in the Hymns to the Mystic Fire, and page number 468 or so. Why was all this necessary? For us to recognize the full sense of corresponding subplanes in the mental being. Here, Sri Aurobindo has just used a phrase, and earlier we read from the portion a few chapters ago where he speaks of subplanes corresponding to those higher ranges. If you can't get to those ranges, where you can enter the corresponding powers in your waking state. But the corresponding planes, why didn't he say, oh, it is this or that? Because it is too complex to summarize here. And for that, we have to go to that text and get the idea of what it really means. It's as if all the possibilities of the higher ranges, all the powers and workings of the higher consciousness are represented inside the domain of your mental span. Intellect being just one point, and above the intellect, we saw those three particularly, which correspond to the Satchit and Ananda operating inside mind. This is accessible to us in full waking consciousness. And yet, at first, when we first touch something of that, Our intellect and power, which is so used to being separate and cut out, tends to blur, tends to dim, tends to feel a little confused because it is meeting something which is wide, even infinite. But bit by bit, it learns to open and integrate itself with these higher gradations, and it is possible to live as a conscious mental being. But we never say narrow intellect, a higher mental or a spiritualized mental being. You can live in an awareness of the Satchidananda revealed in this body, in this life. So it is to this that we are looking when he speaks here. Now we come back to the text. But this causal body is, as we say, little developed in the majority of men, and to live in it or to ascend to the supramental planes, as distinguished from corresponding subplanes in the mental being, or still more to dwell consciously upon them, is the most difficult thing of all for the human being. What is needed? Because we need to be able to do that eventually, otherwise, there is not the possibility of a full divinization. It can be done in the trance of samadhi, that is currently possible to us, but otherwise, only by a new evolution of the capacities of the individual Purusha. Something now has to evolve by which the capacity of our consciousness to enter that and remain in that will be now possible. That is not yet there. And of this capacity, he says, of which few are even willing to conceive. And that's a very strong statement. He's not saying of which a few are willing to accept, to follow. He's saying they're not even willing to conceive that it is possible. And in this matter, Sri Aurobindo is the first in human history to have declared that this is actually possible. And you do not find this declared even in the Veda. In the Veda, there is this awakening, there is this ascent, and there is the immersion. But there is not this possibility that you can actually live on those planes while in the physical body, and the physical body itself participate in this ascent. That is not yet there. And it's not that the rishis might not have been capable, but in that stage of evolution, already what they did was so far ahead of humanity that to have attempted something more would have been premature and would have compromised the work that they had to do to first create this link even to the supramental possibility. And so, in the first emergence out of mind, as the rishis rose to the supramental, they saw this extraordinary domain and possibilities. They rose into it and held in a human body, but the body itself, not able to participate in this, was held as a base, as a support, as a container in which all this would fill and the body would hold, like a jar of mud in which the soma is filled. But the jar has to be strong, otherwise it breaks. And this is the first step. Beyond that, they saw you enter the gates of the sun, and then, of course, you never return. And that was the highest. But once this possibility has sufficiently stamped itself on human evolution and prepared even the human mind, the next step is necessary, where Sri Aurobindo brings this idea, which people are not willing to conceive even as possible, that you can actually rise into those domains and be conscious in the physical body. But they said, no, it's not possible. Your body is like the wick on which the flame forms. The wick burns by the heat of the flame, but the wick cannot become flame. It will always remain separate. And you'll find this statement in many of the ascetic yogic traditions. The body burns out eventually. It cannot contain that heat, and that's fine. But Sri Aurobindo says, no, the body itself now must be able to hold and contain and link all the way that you're able to live in the highest supramental planes in the body. But how is that possible? Because the two are so separate that you go into trance because they are so different. If finiteness meets the infinite, it goes into a swoon. Unless the finiteness can as if open out and become conscious of the infinite. Unless the infinite can assist in preparing the body and transmuting, transforming its very substance to familiarize it and make it capable of the infinity. And this change is as radical as if you were told 3 billion years ago that one day stone will become conscious, that it will move. Impossible. Conceptually, we'll say impossible. And today you are being told by Sri Aurobindo, the physical body itself will know the divine and be in the substantiality of the divine consciousness. You look at the body and you can say, not possible. Or if you're open to the idea, you will say, interesting idea. But it'll be very, 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 very long away, if at all it's possible. And that's the normal turn of the mind. And even some of the great spiritual realized beings who live in that consciousness or who have access to it, and especially those who have access to it, look at the body and say, no way, this is so dark, so dull, so limited, so bound, so inconscient. As impossible as stone could become the beautiful flower and express a psychic quality or become a living being that will actually think as we do. And so Sri Aurobindo makes this observation. There are many yogis in the Himalayas who are watching with keen interest this experiment of a physical transformation. And they say, yes, that sounds interesting, but it's not their interest to put in practice, just to see, will it work? Wow. If it works, we might consider, but I don't think it's possible. Might be possible, something in between. And so there's an interest. And then there are those souls who, by some deep resonance to the ideal, are drawn to the ideal and say, yes, this is what we came for. This is why we took birth to begin with. This is why we entered evolution. Of course, now we have forgotten. But somewhere deep inside us is this resonance. And when Sri Aurobindo says this is necessary, he puts it in rational terms. I understand logically. And then there are philosophers who say, yes, that's an interesting idea. And then they get on with their daily routine. And then there are those souls that say, this is what I'm here for. There's nothing else more important. They drop everything and plunge into this journey. In various degrees of development of mind or surface consciousness, which is all we are aware of, this may reflect in different ways. In the early days of the ashram, many people came and they said this to us in the interviews. One of the persons said, I came because I thought that Sri Aurobindo is going to divinize his body will become immortal. So if I join Sri Aurobindo's ashram, I will also eventually become immortal. So I came to Sri Aurobindo. That's how the surface mind rationalized the urge, the call. But that's not why the soul came. So they had a shock in the mind, in the emotions when Sri Aurobindo left his body. They said, what happened? Where is our immortality? That means we will also die. They didn't leave. One of them even said many times, if this is not going to work out, I will just go back to my village. They didn't, because the call of the soul, struggling against the confusion of the personality, still kept them persisting. And even to the end of the life, the person spoke of what is necessary for the supramental yoga and so on. So one has to recognize there are many layers within us also. We are not always conscious of the soul's call, but the soul is conscious, it recognizes, and it is drawn. And that's why Mother said, and she said it in so many words, she said, are you here because you were called? Because you were promised? Are you here because you were called? Because you were promised that when the time came for the fulfillment, you would be given a chance. For the fulfillment, you would be given a chance. And she says, you do not remember it, but I remember it. And this statement of hers applies to all of us. If reading this, if studying this, if this draws and calls to us, and we find it worthwhile to not only understand, but to accept and to even take the first small steps in the practice, it's because our souls chose this. And in the larger movement of the evolution, these are the souls which are forerunners of the new consciousness and of the new step in evolution. And that's why we are here. And it doesn't matter where you are physically in the world, you are here in spirit in this work of the supramental yoga and the divinization of all life down to the most material physical body, that one day the body will know the divine and manifest the divine as completely and without limitation or distortion, as the higher ranges in us are preparing to right now. So that's why it is a new evolution of the capacities of the individual Purusha, of which few are even willing to conceive. But it is a new evolution, it's a new factor which is being made to awaken by the pressure again of the higher. If it was dependent on our effort, it would be impossible. But because it is the result of the pressure of the higher, Sri Aurobindo declares in so many words, he says, the supramental is in the very nature of things inevitable. The supramental manifestation is the master of this. If it pushes, this has to yield. It's a question of time. But the direct action on the physical matter is slow. Direct action on the conscious, living, thinking, aspiring matter, that is us, is fast. And so we are the focal point of that evolutionary awakening. So he continues, yet is that the condition of the perfect self-consciousness by which alone the Purusha can possess the full conscious control of Prakriti. What we have seen is in the evolution, now we come back to that thing we started with, the whole of all these planes of the cosmos are relationships of soul and power of soul, Purusha and Prakriti. In matter, Purusha is lost in the play of matter and appearance, and it emerges bit by bit. In mind, it has acquired a degree of freedom, and as it rises above mind, it acquires greater and greater freedom. But the full freedom, the full mastery requires this, that we are able now to act, live from the supramental plane in their origin, not in the subplanes in the mind, but in their origin. And then only from there alone, Prakriti will be the free conscious play of Purusha. And therefore, he says, the perfect self consciousness by which alone Purusha can possess the full conscious control of Prakriti. For there, not even the mind determines, but the spirit freely uses the lower differentiating principles as minor terms of its existence, governed by the higher and reaching by them their own perfect capacity. The analogy we may give is to understand this lower differentiating principle. The analogy we may give is in the human being, when you act at the level of an animal, a large part of the action is instinctive. The car moves, the dog barks. It's almost instinctive. Tell the dog to stop, he cannot stop. As you rise into a more human consciousness, you may want to act, but you're able to restrain yourself. The instinct of the action now is still there, but you're able to modify it and even reprogram it. But the principle on which that instinct was organized is still there within your body. And it is by that principle that today you're able to hold objects and wield your body. When, for example, you decide to drink water, you have moved, drunk, swallowed, you are not consciously moving every fine muscle. The full coordination of your hands grasp and the movement of lifting, holding, drinking is taking place at a level which is at the same level as the instinct of the animal to bark and act. But now this instinctive form has been as if connected, plugged in as a secondary, lower working of the free conscious intelligence, which is able to use it freely. Where it has not been sufficiently connected, as in an early childhood of the baby, the hand-eye coordination is poor. Things fall, things slip. When the coordination is complete, now it moves again. It moves perfectly smoothly. So this would be a good example of lower differentiating principle used as a minor term of the existence governed by the higher. When the supramental consciousness, or generally let's say anything above the mind, begins to come into its own, at first there is that and then there is this, and you are as if oscillating between two worlds. Often in the passage, you have a double consciousness. And then bit by bit, this lower one is absorbed into the higher and integrated until you begin to live in the higher and from there act in the lower. So at that point, there'll be the intelligence, let's say your thinking intelligence. You have an intuition and then you have a thinking intelligence. You look into the intuition and then you shift to articulate. You look up, see, and shift down to articulate. This is where the two operations are distinct. When the speaking and action is slowly turned up and lifted up and joins into the higher, you live in the intuitive consciousness and the words flow and form of themselves, using the operation of the lower intelligence, which is still there, but now fully plugged in and transparently allowing this to flow. Still, you may find hesitation in the articulation or in the fingers if you have to play the music and there's a block. I know, I feel the music reaching, and then in the hands, there's a blockage. There's something not moving. And if the fingers also are fully integrated, then you have the maestro, the master, and the intuition flows directly through the fingers. You will remember the mother's description of Sri Aurobindo when he was writing the Arya. He was not writing by longhand, he was typing on the typewriter. And he would tell one of the disciples, let me know when the manuscript is to be given. He would be informed at the appropriate time of the month when he had to send to the press. He would sit down at the typewriter. And the mother says, the inspiration would flow straight down, the mind being completely silent, the source being above mind, flowing through the mind straight into the fingers, and the fingers would be typing perfectly. No hesitation, no stop, no error, practically, except occasionally might happen depending on the degree of the physical integration. 64 pages of writing every month. No need to go back, correct. No need to stop, hesitate. Did I link this? Did I do that? Everything just flows through, perfectly structured. Because lived in a consciousness where everything is seen perfectly, with a silent mind as the linking passage and flowing down into the words form directly. This is possible from that poise. It should be equally possible from the highest poise, which takes all this, still using the machinery, but now wielding it as a lower working. Words are a part of our machinery of communication. But when wielded by this intuitive consciousness, the words just flow. And you wonder at the beauty in which the words are constructed. As all of us have had experiences, when you write a poem that flows through, and sometimes you pause and you wonder, wow, it's so beautiful. I couldn't have thought it even if I wanted to. And the intuition put it like that. And you've written the first 4 lines. By the time you reach the eighth, you see the pattern and you see how beautiful it has been structured. And you didn't know here in your intelligence until the poem is complete. And then you realize how the last 2 lines summarize the whole thing. And it was as if known from before, but not thought out. It was known in a consciousness which held the full experience and unfolded using the power of your developed mind as an inferior operation. So the lower differentiating principle of separation, which belongs to the lower 3 worlds, is used by the higher unified consciousness in this way, wielding all the differences as if all fingers working together in a large harmony as a minor principle, as a minor term of its existence, governed by the higher and reaching by them their own perfect capacity. This is the interesting thing. By the higher, the lower reaches its highest, most perfect capacity. As long as the lower lives for itself, it will always be limited. When it plugs into the higher and serves the higher, all its capacity reaches its culmination and perfection. So when you try to aim at anything high, you can go a long way by your effort. Push, 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 and it becomes more and more strenuous. Less and less return for the effort put, because that's as far as you can go. But when this has sufficiently gone up that it can feel that which is beyond, and it can give itself to that, and that which is beyond begins to fill it, it brings into it the perfection that it was struggling to reach. But it cannot fill it unless this has sufficiently developed to be able to receive. So both movements are needed. An ascending movement that goes as far as it can, but increasingly now opens and gives itself to that which it aspires to reach. And then the descending movement of the higher, which fills this now half-ready material and helps to complete and make it perfect. In a sense, the whole of the integral yoga can be done to a great extent. The ascent to the higher planes and the integration and even the transformation can be done to a great extent without this supramental, relying primarily on these subplanes in the mind, the higher mental, intuitive, overmental, and their three gradations within the overmental. All this is part of the higher planes of the mind, subplanes of the mind. And you can go a long way. But it cannot be made perfect without that last step of the supramental, which is undivided oneness, infinite. That has to then seize and fill and complete what was begun from below. Of course, the sooner you can enter in relation to that, the more rapidly and the more perfectly the rising movement itself will be. So it's a kind of a double thing. From below, the effort is needed, but increasingly, as the link is made with the above, the effort that you make is less and less important, and the action from above becomes more and more important. And there's a smooth transition and handover until the action from above completes and makes perfect. Far more rapidly, far more completely than we could ever hope to do on our own, in our own capacity. But this is what he says is, yet is that the condition of the perfect self-consciousness, by which alone the Purusha can possess the full conscious control of Prakriti. Why? Because it's not the mind which determines, but the spirit freely uses the lower differentiating principles as minor terms of its existence, governed by the higher, and reaching by them their own perfect capacity. That alone would be the perfect evolution of the involved and the development of the undeveloped, for which the Purusha has sought in the material universe, as if in a wager with itself, the conditions of the greatest difficulty. And this is an extraordinary statement which puts in context the whole game. Why at all did we get into this? Why did we get into this most extreme of the material condition? And what's the way to complete that which we came for? So that alone would be the perfect evolution of that which is involved. Remember, I read from the earlier part of the same chapter where Sri Aurobindo says that in the play of the Purusha Prakriti relationships, if the Purusha sets up a relationship with Prakriti in which certain capacities of Sat, Chit, and Ananda are hidden or as if lost, the only purpose for doing that would be to allow them to emerge back. Otherwise, what's the point of hiding? So he has said there, and I'll read this line again. He says, again, the end, the object force and all their workings, and the object must be the possession of itself and of its delight of existence in the world. This is the earlier sentence. The whole purpose of this play must be because it wants to play itself and work itself out and possess itself and its delight. To that, all the circumstances and aims of any world existence must reduce themselves. You can imagine all possible forms of relationship of Purusha, Prakriti, all possible worlds, all possible universes made on any principle of anything. All would reduce itself to this essential idea of circumstance and aim of any world, that it is to find itself and find its ananda. It is existence developing its terms of being. Its if these are involved, their evolution. So if existence is involved, power of being is involved, conscious delight of being is involved, well, the only goal of involving is their evolution. If they are veiled, their self-revelation. If anything is hidden, well, eventually the whole point of hiding is that it must come forward. So now we come to this sentence we have just read. That alone would be the perfect evolution of the involved and the development of the undeveloped, for which the Purusha has sought in the material universe the conditions of the greatest difficulty. So when the Purusha chose to enter this play and all possible relations of the consciousness with its power of creation, of deploying its own possibilities freely, it enters this game so that it may develop all its possibilities. And when is this possibility fully developed? Fully developed when it reaches this highest supramental action, supramental status. So that alone would be the perfect evolution of the involved. Anything involved will find its completion there. Anything undeveloped will find its full development there, because that's the origin, the oneness from which all this emerges. So the logic is perfect, but the implication also is extremely important. You can go all the way up, achieve extraordinary greatnesses, but it would not be perfect and it would not be complete unless it joins finally with the oneness from which it all came, which we call the supramental. And so that alone would be the perfect evolution of the involved and the development of the undeveloped, for which the Purusha has sought in the material universe the conditions of the greatest difficulty. Now comes the second idea. The Purusha, in this whole spectrum of possibilities and domains and worlds, the Purusha could have entered anywhere for the game of evolving and discovering. And it does on many levels, many planes, many beings are as if put out playing that movement of evolution and discovery. But where is it the most challenging? You could have entered straight into the mental plane and played out the game of mind, discovering the divine. Wonderful. You go deeper into the life force and discover from there the divine. Far more difficult. Because in the life energies, the divisions and conflicts are much more hardened and opposing and intense, much more difficult, but also far more interesting and far more rich and challenging. But the most difficult is when you entering the game forget who you are, forget the nature of the game, and even it feels as if you've ceased to exist. And out of that complete self forgetfulness and non existence, you wake up. And now you try to remember, where did I come from? What am I? Where am I going? Who am I? What is all this? What a strange world. So, starting from zero of a total self loss to the full emergence of yourself as the divine Lord and enjoyer of the universe, which is your own body and your own play. That is the full spectrum of possibilities of the delight and the journey. And also, therefore, the condition of greatest difficulty is in matter, where all is lost, as if. So, for which the Purusha has sought in the material universe the conditions of the greatest difficulty. But why would it do that? Why can't it say, well, let me just avoid that. Let me start halfway up the ladder. So there is the parenthetical statement. As if in a wager with itself. Who are you playing with finally? When we play a challenge with someone, I am greater than you, let's fight, let's do this, let's play the game of chess, let's prove who's greater. There is someone else to challenge with. But in the consciousness of the oneness of the divine, where is the other? There is no other. So any wager you have is with yourself. You look at this possibility of complete self loss and you say, what a challenge it will be for me to experience that complete self loss and wake up. And the challenge is with yourself. Can I do this? Of course I can. And boom, you plunge into it. What you see is what becomes, because that's the nature of the divine consciousness. Whatever it conceives of, it flows to manifest and experience. So we reread the sentence, that which is this ascent to the supramental planes, that alone would be the perfect evolution of the involved and the development of the undeveloped, for which the Purusha has sought in the material universe, as if in a wager with itself, the conditions of the greatest difficulty. And with this, he completes the chapter that describes all the planes of existence as relationships of the Purusha and Prakriti, and the entire complex play across all these levels. And this came from an earlier discussion where he describes how the consciousness living in the oneness must now turn to the multiplicity and re-embrace the whole multiplicity. And the first step in the re-embracement he took with the principle of this division of consciousness and force of consciousness, Purusha and Prakriti. In this, the oneness between the two, and then through this, the play of multiplicity and the underlying oneness in which the whole multiplicity takes place. And this is how we came to the chapter on the planes of consciousness. The next chapter takes up this whole question. Such is the constituent principle of the various worlds of cosmic existence and the various planes of our being. They are as if a ladder plunging down into matter and perhaps below it, rising up into the heights of the spirit, even perhaps to the point at which existence escapes out of cosmic being into ranges of supra-cosmic absolute. And he says, to our ordinary materialized consciousness, all this does not exist because it is hidden from us. So, what is the nature of this lower triple status, and what is its relationship with that of which we are not conscious? That becomes the theme of the next chapter. And so, we will take this up next Friday. For now, we simply look back at the big picture of the cosmos. And the underlying idea before the chapter was the oneness which embraces it all and which manifests in this multiplicity. And here he has revealed to you the mechanism, the machinery of multiplicity, not only for the universe, but also within us, and what makes for these planes within us. Understanding which gives us the key, not only to our own full awakening and mastery, but also to our true relationship with the universe and our mastery in the play of the universe. That's why this chapter is so important. We can pause here and take up any comments or questions. It's a vast vision and very complete in itself, and it's more helpful to keep ourselves immersed in it. It's possible to maintain something of the background of this large vision in the mind, in a deeper part of the mind, in the midst of our daily life. It's not difficult, but it requires a little bit of practice. And you may, for example, read this passage or some such passage which summarizes this whole vision, dwell in the vision for a while, and then you get up and walk. maintaining this immersion and looking at everything around you from this perspective. Every tree is nothing but the divine consciousness struggling to emerge out of rock. The rock itself is the divine consciousness choosing to immerse itself in trance of sleep. And every human being is a more awakened poise of that consciousness. And I and all others, we are all in part of this gigantic ascending movement of the rising consciousness. And then you gaze up and you look at the sky and all the physical aspect of it, but beyond that, the symbolic aspect of the divine leaning down from above to embrace all this manifestation and yourself and all the beings. And the divine from above, like a ladder plunging down, pours himself into us. And we, as if rising along the ladder, open ourselves in aspiration to the divine. And you dwell on this idea with your eyes open through your senses as you walk, or then as you enter work, some simple work where you can be dwelling in this mood. And then perhaps you lose yourself in the work. But you can begin with a meditation like this, which can be a fully conscious, active, sensory meditation, dwelling on the divine and the sense of your place, your purpose in life. And it can be very powerful, and it strongly reorients our priorities in activity to this larger sense of purpose. And I would suggest for you to do this. Perhaps we can even do this now as we leave from here, but also to do this for a few minutes every day. It can be very helpful. Sri Aurobindo, I've shared perhaps this story before, and Sri Aurobindo, it was shared with us by the disciple who came to Sri Aurobindo in the early days and asked to be his disciple. Sri Aurobindo explained the difference of the approach of the integral yoga and asked if he would accept, and he says yes. Then Sri Aurobindo looked at him and said, although there is no formal initiation, you are accepted. And then he paused, walked over to the window, and looked down. In the garden, in the courtyard of the ashram, there were pots which had been washed by the gardener and kept in the sun to dry. So, inclined, turned to the sun, the sunlight filling to dry. And Sri Aurobindo called the disciple and pointed to those pots and said, you must become like this. And in that one image, you have the whole yoga captured. In the Vedic image, you are the pot, the container, opening to the sun of the truth, the divine, washed, purified to whatever extent, and opened to receive, and allowing the divine to fill you, mold you, shape you, and lift you. So we can dwell on this theme as we chant Om together. Om.